Lydia Harper stood trembling in the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, her thin arms clutching her 6-month-old daughter, Sophia, tightly against her chest. The threadbare diaper bag, patched together with cheap white thread from Dollar Tree, dangled precariously from her shoulder, threatening to split open with every shaky step. Her worn-out sneakers, soles so thin they exposed the torn lining, squeaked faintly on the airplane floor as she staggered toward row 23. The evening flight from Chicago to San Francisco was packed with the kind of people who embodied the American dream she'd never touch. Businessmen in glossy Armani suits, middle-aged women with Michael Kors handbags and a faint whiff of Chanel perfume, their sleek MacBook Pros glinting in their laps. Lydia felt every judgmental stare slicing through her like invisible knives, stripping away the last scraps of dignity she clung to. Her crumpled uniform from the Greasy Spoon where she worked, a faded t-shirt emblazoned with Route 66 Diner, in peeling letters, paired with jeans frayed at the knees, marked her as an outsider among the sea of tailored sophistication. Headphone welcome to Soul Deep Stories. Glowing star, if you're deeply immersed in this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more heart-touching stories. Sparkling heart. Pushpin, I have a small challenge for you. Comment below and let us know which country you're listening from and what time it is. For example, I'm in New York, USA, enjoying this story at 9 p.m. Crescent Moon. How about you? Let's connect with each other from all around the world. Globe showing Europe, Africa sparkles. Speech balloon, don't forget to like and share to spread these meaningful stories to more people. Thank you for being a part of Soul Deep Stories. Red heart. Sophia stirred slightly in her arms, her big, innocent eyes peering up at her mother, tiny fingers gripping the cheap brass necklace, Lydia's only piece of jewelry, a locket holding a blurry photo of Daniel, the father who'd vanished the moment she told him she was pregnant. Please, Sophia, be good for mommy, Lydia whispered, her cracked lips brushing her daughter's forehead, her breath trembling with exhaustion and dread. Beneath that plea lay a deeper terror, the fear that this flight, her last desperate shot at escaping the grinding poverty of Chicago, would collapse under the weight of a single cry. For 6 months she'd lived in a state of unrelenting deprivation, a crumbling studio apartment in Chicago's South Side slums, where rusty water dripped from the faucet and the stench of mold clung to every warped floorboard. Nights spent hungry so she could scrape together pennies from the pitiful tips she earned at the diner, where customers often left a few quarters instead of dollars. Days sneaking Sophia into work because she couldn't afford a babysitter, hiding her under the counter while her hands shook carrying trays. This flight, a budget ticket snagged off Priceline for $89, plus a $25 baggage fee, was everything she'd sacrificed for. A chance at a job in her Aunt Clara's San Francisco restaurant, a paycheck that might finally let her rent a clean little place, buy decent formula for Sophia, and maybe, just maybe, claw her way out of the suffocating cycle of poverty. She struggled to shove her carry-on into the overhead bin, one arm cradling Sophia, the other yanking at the bag's frayed corner, where a half-used pack of Huggies and a handful of Walmart's cheapest wet wipes, $1 for 50, peeked out shamefully. Sweat beaded on her forehead, soaking into the thin, hole-riddled sweater she hadn't had time to mend, a $2 thrift store find from Goodwill last winter. Just then, a deep, steady voice cut through her panic. "Let me help you with that." Lydia turned, her breath catching as she faced a tall man dressed like he'd stepped straight out of a Wall Street boardroom. Ethan Caldwell, though she didn't yet know his name, wore a charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, likely from Brooks Brothers or some even pricier label she'd only glimpsed in dog-eared magazines at the clinic waiting room. His polished leather shoes, probably Johnston & Murphy, gleamed under the cabin lights, and as he reached up to lift her bag with ease, his sleeve slid back to reveal a Rolex Submariner, its stainless steel face worth more than her annual rent. His green eyes sparkled with a kindness that crinkled their corners, and his faint smile hinted at a man past his mid-30s who carried the effortless charm of success. "Thank you," Lydia mumbled, her voice hoarse as she sank into the middle seat, clutching Sophia tighter as if someone might snatch her away. Ethan settled into the window seat beside her, and in that instant she couldn't ignore the brutal divide between them. He was the American dream incarnate, a man who likely lived in a loop penthouse with skyline views, sipping Starbucks lattes each morning instead of the watery instant coffee she bought at Aldi, driving a BMW or Tesla instead of jostling on the CTA bus with the weary masses. The white gold wedding band on his finger caught the cabin's fluorescent glow, conjuring images of a stable, comfortable life, something Lydia had never dared imagine. She, meanwhile, was a ghost of failure, hands rough from scrubbing dishes at the diner, hair a tangled mess she couldn't afford to trim, the faint smell of stale coffee clinging to her from yesterday's 12-hour shift, unwashed because the communal laundry in her tenement had been broken for weeks. As the flight attendants began their safety spiel, Lydia glanced down at Sophia, still quiet, fiddling with the laminated safety card she'd handed her as a makeshift toy, a pitiful substitute for the bright Fisher-Price gadgets she saw in ads but could never buy. She stole a look at Ethan, watching him check his phone, a pristine latest model iPhone, not a scratch on it, unlike her prepaid Nokia from Walmart, a $20 relic that died mid-call half the time. The plane taxied onto the runway, engines roaring like a warning, and Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. Everything, the dream of a warm San Francisco kitchen, the smell of fresh bread from Aunt Clara's oven, Sophia's laughter in a home where the lights didn't flicker from unpaid bills, hinged on this flight going smoothly. But then, as if fate had sharpened its claws, Sophia's lower lip quivered. Lydia knew that sign too well. A cry was coming. She fumbled for the pacifier in her pocket, but it was too late. Sophia's first wail tore through the cabin, sharp and piercing, just as the plane lifted off. The sound ricocheted, drowning out the engines, drawing dozens of eyes toward Lydia with unmasked irritation. A businessman ahead sighed loudly, jamming on a pair of Bose headphones. A woman across the aisle muttered about irresponsible mothers, her tone venomous as if Lydia had personally ruined her flight. Lydia's face burned with shame, tears prickling as she rocked Sophia, hands trembling as she reached for the bottle of formula she'd mixed with tap water at the airport, cheap stuff from WIC vouchers, the kind she worried wasn't good enough for her baby. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking as she bounced Sophia, but the cries only grew louder, echoing in the tight space like an accusation. The altitude shift must have hurt Sophia's tiny ears, and Lydia felt helpless, knowing she could do nothing but pray for it to stop. Every glare stabbed at her, a reminder. She was a failure, a 24-year-old single mom who couldn't even keep her kid quiet, a blemish on the polished surface of modern America. She rummaged through her bag for anything to calm Sophia, a wipe, a stale cracker she'd salvaged from the diner floor yesterday, but nothing worked. Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks, hot and bitter, mingling with the despair that had shadowed her since Daniel walked out. She remembered that day, their dingy Austin apartment, the sour reek of cheap beer on his breath as he stared at her with cold eyes and said, "Deal with it yourself," before slamming the door, leaving her 2 months pregnant with $13 in her bank account. Since then she'd fought alone, queuing for hours at the food bank for milk and stale bread, sleeping on a friend's couch when evicted for unpaid rent, even selling her mother's silver ring, her last family keepsake, for Sophia's diapers. Now, on this plane with Sophia's cries and the passengers' contempt bearing down, Lydia felt like she was plummeting into an abyss where all hope dissolved. That's when Ethan Caldwell leaned over, his voice soft but cutting through Sophia's wails. "May I help?" Before Lydia could respond, he began murmuring something, a soothing melody like a lullaby from those old PBS movies she'd watched as a kid. His green eyes locked onto Sophia's and miraculously, her cries softened, then stopped. Sophia stared at him, wide-eyed and glistening, her tiny hands reaching out as if drawn to this strange savior. Lydia's jaw dropped, tears still streaking her face, disbelief crashing over her. The cabin fell quiet, save for the hum of the engines, and in that moment, a flicker of light pierced her darkness, not just because Sophia had stopped, but because Ethan's gaze, warm yet tinged with sorrow, seemed to see her pain more clearly than anyone else on this flight. Even as that fragile peace settled, Lydia couldn't shake the dread coiling in her chest. This man, with his bespoke suit, gleaming watch, and the quiet confidence of someone who'd never known hunger, belonged to a world she'd never enter. He was the America she envied from afar. Dinners at upscale bistros with $50 glasses of wine, vacations in Lake Tahoe or Maui, mornings with the Wall Street Journal in a sunlit condo. And her? She was the survivor on society's fringes, lining up at Salvation Army for Sophia's winter coat, counting pennies for bus fare, praying each night her baby wouldn't get sick without insurance. That gulf made her grateful yet terrified. He could help her now, but what then? When the plane landed, he'd return to his gilded life, and she'd keep scraping by with overdue bills and broken dreams. What Lydia didn't suspect was that this man wasn't just a fleeting rescuer. He carried a secret in the sleek leather briefcase at his feet, a secret that would upend her life forever, waiting to unfurl like a storm on the horizon. The engines of the Boeing 737 growled as it taxied down the runway at O'Hare, the vibration rattling through the cramped cabin like a warning of the chaos to come. Lydia Harper clutched Sophia tighter, her bony fingers digging into the thin blanket she'd scavenged from a Salvation Army bin, the only shield between her 6-month-old daughter and the chilly recycled air. Row 23 felt like a battlefield already. Her patched-up diaper bag slumped against her scuffed sneakers, a pitiful barricade against the sea of polished briefcases and designer carry-ons surrounding her. The evening flight to San Francisco was a pressure cooker of middle-class America. Corporate types in crisp suits tapping away at their laptops, a woman in a cashmere sweater scrolling through her iPad, the faint clink of a martini glass from first class wafting back. Lydia's faded Route 66 diner t-shirt and ripped jeans screamed her status. A broke single mom who didn't belong, and she could feel the weight of their stares, sharp and accusing, slicing through the thin veneer of hope she'd patched together for this trip. Sophia whimpered softly, her tiny hands tugging at Lydia's brass locket, the one memento of Daniel she hadn't pawned off for diaper money. "Shoo, baby please," Lydia murmured, her voice cracking as she pressed her dry lips to Sophia's forehead, praying the little girl wouldn't unravel her fragile plan. This flight wasn't just a ticket out of Chicago's South Side hellhole, the roach-infested studio with its busted heater and flickering lights. It was her lifeline. 6 months of scraping by on diner tips, skipping meals to save for this $89 Priceline deal, dodging eviction notices, and begging the WIC office for extra formula had led to this moment. A job at Aunt Clara's restaurant in San Francisco, a chance to stop counting pennies at the Aldi checkout and give Sophia something better than hand-me-downs from the church basement. Every jolt of the plane felt like a test, and Lydia's pulse hammered in her ears as the engines roared louder, the runway blurring past the window. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle gleam of his Rolex catching the cabin lights as he settled into the window seat. His charcoal suit hugged his broad shoulders like it was born there, the kind of bespoke tailoring you'd see on Michigan Avenue, not the discount racks at TJ Maxx where Lydia scavenged for Sophia's onesies. He exuded the effortless polish of a man who'd never known a shut-off notice or a maxed-out EBT card. A corporate lawyer, she'd guess, the type who sipped single malt scotch at rooftop bars while she scrubbed grease off diner plates for $2.13 an hour plus tips. His green eyes flicked toward her briefly, a flicker of curiosity or pity she couldn't read, and she shrank into herself, tugging her whole riddled sweater over the coffee stains on her sleeve. The contrast burned, his world of steak dinners and 401k's versus her reality of ramen packets and pawnshop haggling. The flight attendants launched into their safety demo, their polished voices droning over the intercom as the plane lurched forward. Sophia stayed quiet, gnawing on the safety card Lydia had handed her, a sorry excuse for a toy, but the only thing she could offer when Target's toy aisle was a distant dream. Lydia's stomach twisted as the plane picked up speed, the stakes clawing at her chest. She'd poured everything into this, every skipped lunch, every night shivering under a thin blanket so she could stash a few bucks in an old coffee can. If this flight went south, if Sophia lost it, she'd be back to square one, begging for shifts at the diner, dodging the landlord's threats, and watching Sophia grow up in a world where treat meant a stale donut from the day-old bin. The engine screamed as the wheels left the ground, and for a fleeting second she dared to hope, until Sophia's lip quivered. "No, no, no," Lydia hissed under her breath, fumbling for the pacifier in her pocket, her fingers clumsy with panic. Too late. Sophia's wail erupted, a high-pitched shriek that sliced through the cabin like a siren, bouncing off the walls as the plane climbed. Heads whipped around, eyes narrowing with disgust. The businessman in front jammed his Bose headphones on with a theatrical huff, his muttered "Jesus Christ" barely muffled. A woman across the aisle, decked out in a Burberry scarf, shot Lydia a look that could curdle milk, her lips curling as she whispered, "Some people shouldn't fucking breed." Lydia's face flamed, her heart sinking as Sophia's cries escalated, a relentless crescendo that drowned out the safety spiel and turned every passenger into a judge and jury. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," Lydia choked out, rocking Sophia desperately, her voice lost in the storm of her daughter's sobs. She dug into her bag, pulling out the bottle of watery formula she'd stretched with tap water. A WIC special, barely enough to keep Sophia's belly full, but the baby thrashed, knocking it against the tray table with a dull thud. The cries pierced her eardrums and Lydia's vision blurred with tears, her hands shaking as she tried every trick, bouncing, shushing, humming a broken tune. Nothing worked. The cabin pressure must have been hell on Sophia's ears, and Lydia's gut twisted with guilt. She couldn't even afford eardrops, let alone a doctor's visit. The stares grew heavier, a chorus of silent accusations. Trashy single mom. Welfare queen. Can't control her damn kid. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every flaw magnified, the holes in her shoes, the frayed hem of her jeans, the way she smelled faintly of fryer grease in desperation. Then Ethan shifted beside her, his jaw tightening as he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing nothing but fabric. "Where the hell's my wallet?" he muttered, his voice low but edged with suspicion. He turned to Lydia, his green eyes narrowing, and the air between them crackled with sudden tension. "Did you take it?" he snapped, louder now, his tone slicing through Sophia's wails like a blade. Lydia froze, the bottle slipping in her sweaty grip as his words hit her like a punch. "What?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, drowned by the chaos. "You heard me," Ethan barked, leaning closer, his polished demeanor cracking. "My wallet was right here and now it's gone. You think I didn't see you pawing through your shitty bag? What, you figured I wouldn't notice a fucking thief sitting next to me?" His words dripped with venom, each one a lash against her already raw nerves. Sophia's cries hit a new pitch, a banshee scream that made the woman across the aisle groan. "Oh, for fuck's sake, shut that brat up." Lydia's chest heaved, panic and shame colliding as Ethan's accusation sank in. She shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. I swear I didn't touch anything." "Bullshit," Ethan shot back, his voice rising, drawing more eyes. "You're a goddamn mess, you and that screaming kid. What's next? You gonna pickpocket my watch too? People like you always have some sob story, don't they? Poor little single mom, boo fucking who." He rummaged through his seat pocket, his movements sharp and furious, as if he'd already convicted her. The businessman ahead turned, sneering, "Hey asshole, keep it down, some of us paid for this flight." Ethan glared back but didn't relent, his gaze pinning Lydia like a bug. "Check your bag," he demanded, his tone cold as steel. "Now." Lydia's hands trembled as she clutched Sophia, her daughter's sobs a relentless hammer against her skull. "I didn't take it," she sobbed, her voice breaking as she unzipped her bag with one hand, spilling its pathetic contents. A crumpled pack of wipes, a half-empty formula bottle, a crusty burp cloth. "See? Nothing. I'm not a thief, I'm just trying to get by." Her words dissolved into a whimper, drowned by Sophia's wails and the growing murmur of the cabin, a mix of annoyance and morbid curiosity. Ethan's eyes flicked over the mess, his lip curling in disgust. "Yeah right. Trying to get by, more like trying to rip me off. Fucking lowlife." The insult hit like a slap, and Lydia's tears flowed hotter, her body shaking as she hugged Sophia closer. The baby's cries now a raw, guttural howl that seemed to echo her own humiliation. I wouldn't," she stammered, but the words choked in her throat. She'd faced judgment before, the cashier's sneer when her card got declined, the landlord's threats when rent was late, but this was a new low, a public execution at 30,000 feet. The woman across the aisle leaned over, her voice dripping with scorn. "Why the hell'd you even bring that little shit on here? Can't afford a babysitter, huh? Figures." Lydia flinched, her head bowing as if she could disappear into the seat, her sobs mingling with Sophia's in a symphony of despair. Ethan's hand froze mid-search, his wallet tumbling out from under his own seat cushion, the sleek leather mocking his outburst. His face stiffened, a flash of something, guilt maybe, crossing his features before he masked it. "Fuck," he muttered, snatching it up, his voice dropping to a growl. "Fine, my mistake. But get that kid under control for Christ's sake, it's giving me a goddamn headache." Lydia stared at him, her breath hitching, torn between relief and rage. You think I want this?" she spat, her voice raw and trembling. "You think I like being screamed at by some rich prick who doesn't know shit about me? I'm doing my best, okay? My best." Her outburst startled Sophia into a brief, hiccuping silence, her big eyes darting between them, but the reprieve lasted only seconds before the wails resumed, louder, angrier. Ethan rubbed his temples, his jaw clenched as he leaned back, the fight draining out of him. "Yeah well, your best is fucking loud," he grumbled, but the edge in his voice softened, his gaze flickering to Sophia's tear-streaked face. The cabin buzzed with tension, passengers whispering, "What a shit show, poor guy stuck next to that," as Lydia rocked Sophia, her own tears falling onto her daughter's matted hair. She wanted to scream back, to claw at Ethan's perfect suit and smug face, but exhaustion pinned her down, her fight crumbling under the weight of his words and the world's disdain. She was a nobody, a broken nobody, and he was a king in a castle she'd never enter, his wallet back in his pocket like nothing had happened, while her life teetered on the edge of collapse. Then, as if the universe hadn't kicked her enough, Sophia's flailing arm knocked the formula bottle onto Ethan's lap, the tepid liquid soaking into his pristine trousers. "Oh, for fuck's sake," he roared, jumping up, the stain spreading like an insult. Lydia gasped, scrambling to grab it, her apologies tumbling out in a frantic rush. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean." But Ethan waved her off, his face a storm of frustration and something darker, his hands brushing at the mess as if it were toxic. Just stop," he snapped, his voice tight. "Keep your damn kid away from me." He sank back into his seat, glaring out the window, the city lights below, a distant promise neither of them could grasp. Lydia hugged Sophia close, her sobs quieting into ragged breaths as the baby's cries finally faltered, exhaustion claiming her tiny body. The cabin settled into an uneasy hush, the hum of the engines a dull backdrop to the wreckage of their clash. Ethan's accusation hung between them, a festering wound. He'd seen her as a thief, a parasite, a stereotype in torn clothes, and she'd seen him as a heartless bastard, a symbol of everything she'd never have. Neither knew that this collision, this raw, ugly misunderstanding, was only the beginning, that the wallet was nothing compared to the secrets tucked in Ethan's briefcase, secrets that would soon bind them in ways neither could escape. For now they sat in brittle silence, two strangers at war, with Sophia's soft whimpers the only bridge across the chasm. The Boeing 737 hummed steadily at cruising altitude, its cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, casting long shadows over the rows of dozing passengers. Lydia Harper sat hunched in her middle seat, her arms wrapped protectively around Sophia, whose cries had finally dwindled into fitful whimpers, the baby's tiny chest heaving with exhaustion. The sting of Ethan Caldwell's accusation still burned in her gut. "Fucking thief, lowlife," words that had flayed her open in front of strangers, exposing every raw nerve she tried to bury under years of scraping by. Her threadbare sweater clung to her sweat-damp skin, the formula stain on her jeans a bitter reminder of the chaos that had erupted just an hour ago. She stared at the safety card clutched in Sophia's chubby fist, her only toy, and felt a sob lodge in her throat. This flight, her fragile lifeline to a job at Aunt Clara's restaurant in San Francisco, was unraveling, and with it, the dream of a life where she wouldn't have to count quarters at the gas station or beg for extensions on the electric bill. Beside her, Ethan sat rigid, his jaw tight, his stained trousers a silent testament to their clash. The wallet he'd accused her of stealing lay in his lap, retrieved from under his seat after his furious outburst, but the venom of his words lingered like a bruise. He'd barely glanced at her since, his green eyes fixed on the black void beyond the window, the city lights of Chicago long gone. The silence between them was a wall, thick, cold, and spiked with mistrust. Lydia wanted to hate him, this polished lawyer in his Brooks Brothers suit who'd judged her so easily, who'd seen her poverty and assumed the worst. But beneath her anger simmered a deeper ache, the shame of being seen, of being reduced to a stereotype in his eyes. The broke single mom, the welfare case, the trash he'd cursed her as. Then, as if the tension hadn't already frayed her to breaking, Ethan stood abruptly, brushing past her without a word, his knee knocking her elbow as he headed down the aisle. Lydia flinched, clutching Sophia closer, her pulse spiking with fresh dread. What now? She thought, her mind racing. Was he complaining to the crew? Reporting her for the spill? She watched his broad back disappear toward the rear of the plane, his stride clipped and purposeful, and her stomach knotted tighter. She couldn't afford trouble, not with everything riding on this trip, not with Sophia's future balanced on a razor's edge. Her tears welled again, hot and silent, as she rocked her daughter, whispering, "We're okay, baby, we're okay," a lie she barely believed. In the cramped airplane bathroom, Ethan splashed cold water on his face, the icy sting doing little to dull the heat of his shame. He gripped the sink's edge, staring at his reflection in the smudged mirror, the tailored suit, the Rolex glinting on his wrist, the man he'd built himself into after years of clawing up from nothing. But tonight, that man had crumbled, lashing out like some entitled prick at a woman who'd done nothing but struggle. He'd lost his wallet, or thought he had, and turned on Lydia like a rabid dog, spewing filth he hadn't meant, words he'd never have dared say in his polished office on LaSalle Street. "Fucking thief," he'd called her, and the memory twisted his gut. He patted his pockets again, a reflex, and froze. His hand brushed something solid in his jacket's inner lining. The wallet slipped into a tear he hadn't noticed, left behind when he'd washed his hands earlier after a coffee spill. "Shit," he breathed, pulling it out, the leather cool and damning in his palm. It hadn't been under the seat. She hadn't taken it. He'd lost it himself, left it on the sink like some careless idiot, and instead of checking, he'd torn into her. A woman already beaten down by life, her eyes red from crying, her kids screaming because she couldn't fix the world for her. Ethan's chest tightened, a wave of self-loathing crashing over him. He saw his daughter's face, Lily, gone 3 years now, in Sophia's tear-streaked cheeks, and the parallel gutted him. He'd been a father once, a husband, a man who knew loss, and yet he'd kicked Lydia when she was down, spitting venom because her mess had spilled onto his perfect little bubble. "God damn it," he muttered, raking a hand through his hair, his reflection blurring as his eyes stung. "You had to fix this." Back in the cabin, Lydia's heart leapt as Ethan reappeared, his face pale, his stride slower now, almost hesitant. She braced herself, expecting another barb, but he stopped beside her seat, his hands fidgeting with something. His wallet. "Lydia," he said, his voice low, rough with something she couldn't place. She looked up, her breath catching at the shift in his eyes, no longer cold but soft, almost broken. "I fucked up," he said, and the rawness in his tone hit her like a shockwave. "I found it, in the bathroom. I left it there earlier, didn't even check. I thought you took it and I was an asshole. A complete asshole." Lydia blinked, her tears spilling over as his words sank in, a floodgate of relief and confusion bursting open. You found it?" she whispered, her voice trembling, Sophia stirring against her chest. Ethan nodded, sinking into his seat, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his mistake had crushed him. "Yeah, and I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry, Lydia. I had no right, none, to say what I did. You didn't deserve that." His gaze dropped to Sophia, then back to her, and the guilt in his eyes was a mirror to her own pain. "I don't know what you're going through, but I saw you struggling and instead of helping I made it worse. I'm a bastard for that." Her throat tightened, emotions colliding, anger, exhaustion, and a flicker of something softer she couldn't name. "You called me a thief," she said, her voice cracking, the hurt spilling out. "A lowlife. You think I'd steal from you? Because I'm some broke-ass single mom with a screaming kid? That's all you saw, isn't it?" Ethan flinched, his hands clenching in his lap. "I did," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I was wrong. Dead wrong. I let my own crap, my own bullshit, take over and I took it out on you. I can't undo it, but I swear I'll make it right." Lydia stared at him, her chest heaving, Sophia's soft hiccups punctuating the silence. She wanted to scream, to tell him to shove his apology, but the sincerity in his face, the way his hands shook slightly, the way his eyes pleaded, stopped her cold. "How?" she asked, her voice small, fragile. "How do you make that right?" Ethan swallowed hard, then reached into his briefcase, pulling out a pack of pretzels and a bottled water from the flight attendant's earlier pass. "Start small," he said, offering them to her. "You didn't take anything when they came by, I noticed. Let me at least do this. Please." She hesitated, pride warring with need, but Sophia's quiet fussing tipped the scale. She took the water, her fingers brushing his, a jolt of warmth cutting through her numbness. "Thanks," she muttered, cracking it open, her hand still trembling as she poured a little into the bottle cap to dab on Sophia's lips. Ethan watched, his expression softening further. "She's beautiful," he said quietly, his voice catching. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." Lydia glanced at him, curiosity piercing her guard. "Who?" she asked, and the question slipped out before she could stop it. Ethan's eyes clouded, his fingers tracing the wedding band on his left hand. "My daughter," he said, the words heavy, raw. "Lily. She'd be 4 now. Lost her, and my wife Catherine, 3 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver." The confession hung there, a fragile thread between them, and Lydia's breath hitched, her anger dissolving into something deeper, sadder. "Oh God," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm, then pulling back. I'm so sorry." He shook his head, a faint, pained smile tugging at his lips. "Don't be. It's not your burden. But seeing Sophia, it hit me. I used to know how to calm a crying kid. Guess I forgot." Lydia's tears fell anew, but these were different, softer, laced with empathy instead of shame. "She's all I've got," she said, her voice breaking as she looked at Sophia, now sucking on the bottle cap, her eyes drooping. "Her dad, Daniel, he bailed when I told him I was pregnant. Left me with nothing but this locket and a stack of bills. I've been fighting ever since, and tonight felt like I was losing." Ethan leaned closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not losing. You're here fighting for her. That's more than most would do. I was a jackass to not see it." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a sharp jolt that made Sophia whimper, and without thinking Ethan reached over, his hand hovering near her tiny one. "May I?" he asked, and Lydia nodded, too tired to resist. He took Sophia's hand, humming softly, "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," a tune that tugged at Lydia's memory, and to her shock Sophia settled, her cries fading into sleepy murmurs. Lydia watched, her heart swelling, a dam breaking inside her. "How'd you," she started, but the words caught as she saw the tears in Ethan's eyes, quickly blinked away. "Lily loved that song," he said, his voice thick. "Catherine sang it every night. After they were gone I couldn't hear it without breaking. But now, it feels right." Lydia's hand found his this time, a tentative touch, and he didn't pull away. "You're good with her," she said, a faint smile breaking through her tears. "I can't get her to sleep without pacing half the night." Ethan chuckled, a rough, broken sound. "Practice, I guess. And guilt's a hell of a motivator tonight." The next hour passed in a fragile truce, Sophia dozing in Lydia's arms as they talked, haltingly at first, then freer. She told him about the diner, the endless shifts, the way she'd hidden Sophia under the counter when daycare wasn't an option. He shared fragments of his life. The law firm, the late nights that kept him from picking Lily up that rainy night, the crash that stole everything. "I keep thinking if I'd left on time," he trailed off, and Lydia squeezed his hand. "You can't carry that," she said softly. "I tell myself the same about Daniel. If I'd been enough, maybe he'd have stayed. But we can't change it." Ethan nodded, his thumb brushing hers, a quiet anchor in the storm. "You're stronger than you know," he said, his green eyes locking with hers, and the intensity made her breath catch. "I saw it the second you didn't back down from me even when I was a dick." Lydia blushed, a warmth spreading through her she hadn't felt in years. "I'm just stubborn," she said, and he laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. "That's a start," he replied, and the plane's hum seemed to fade, leaving just them, two broken souls finding something in the wreckage. As the flight wore on, Sophia stirred, reaching for Ethan's tie, her tiny fingers tugging the silk. Lydia moved to stop her, but he waved her off, lifting Sophia gently into his arms with a practiced ease that stole her breath. "She's got a grip," he said, grinning as Sophia babbled, and Lydia's heart flipped, a mix of awe and ache at how natural they looked. "You're a natural," she said, and his smile faltered, a shadow crossing his face. "Used to be," he murmured, but then he met her gaze and the shadow lifted. "Maybe I can be again." Their hands brushed as he handed Sophia back, and the touch lingered, electric and unspoken. Lydia felt it, a pull, a thread weaving between them, fragile but real. "Why San Francisco?" he asked, and she told him. The job, Aunt Clara's Italian recipes, the hope of health insurance for Sophia. He listened, leaning in, and when she finished he said, "Sounds like a fresh start. You deserve it." She smiled, tentative but genuine. "Maybe we both do," she replied, and his eyes softened, a silent agreement passing between them. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent, but Lydia barely heard it. Ethan's apology, his vulnerability, had cracked something open, not just forgiveness, but a connection she hadn't expected at 35,000 feet. She didn't know about the letter in his briefcase yet, the one tying her to Daniel's estate, but she felt the shift. A man who'd lost everything meeting a woman who'd never had much, finding something neither could name. As the plane dipped toward San Francisco, Ethan took her hand again and she let him, their fingers lacing together over Sophia's sleeping form. A promise, a beginning born from a misunderstanding that had nearly torn them apart. The Boeing 737 sliced through the night sky, its engines a steady drone beneath the dim cabin lights, but inside Lydia Harper's chest, a storm raged. 3 hours into the flight from Chicago to San Francisco, her 6-month-old daughter Sophia slept fitfully in her arms, her tiny breaths a fragile tether to calm after the chaos of their earlier clash. Lydia's hands still trembled from Ethan Caldwell's venomous accusations, "fucking thief," "lowlife," words that had stripped her bare in front of a plane full of strangers. But his apology, raw and unguarded, had cracked something open between them, a tentative bridge built from shared pain and whispered confessions. Now, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, she stole glances at him. His Brooks Brothers suit rumpled from Sophia's formula spill, his green eyes shadowed with a sadness she couldn't unsee since he'd spoken of Lily and Catherine, lost to a drunk driver's recklessness. Her own losses, Daniel's abandonment, the endless grind of poverty, felt smaller beside his, yet somehow heavier in their immediacy. Ethan sat beside her, his fingers tracing the edge of his wallet, the leather a silent witness to his shame. Finding it in the bathroom sink an hour ago had gutted him, not just the relief of its return, but the realization of how viciously he'd lashed out at Lydia, a woman whose threadbare sweater and tear-streaked face screamed a life he'd never known. He'd spent years burying his grief in billable hours and scotch, but tonight her resilience, her quiet fight for Sophia, had unearthed something in him, a flicker of the man he'd been before the crash stole his family. Their hands had brushed when he'd handed Sophia back after soothing her with Lily's lullaby, and the warmth of that touch lingered, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. But in his briefcase, tucked beneath legal pads and a flask he hadn't touched, lay a letter that could shatter this fragile peace. A truth about Daniel, Sophia's father, that would either bind them closer or break them apart forever. Lydia shifted, adjusting Sophia's weight, her worn-out sneakers scuffing the floor. "I need to change her," she murmured, her voice soft but strained, the exhaustion of the night etched into every syllable. Ethan nodded, offering a faint smile. "Need help?" he asked, and she shook her head, a flicker of independence flaring despite her fatigue. "I've got it. Been doing it alone long enough." She stood, cradling Sophia, and shuffled toward the lavatory, her diaper bag swinging like a pendulum of survival, patched with Dollar Tree thread. Stuffed with the last of her Wix-applied wipes. Ethan watched her go, his chest tightening with a mix of admiration and guilt, then turned to his briefcase, his fingers hovering over the clasp. He shouldn't look, not yet, but the letter burned in his mind, a secret he couldn't outrun. In the tiny bathroom, Lydia balanced Sophia on the fold-down changing table, her hands moving with practiced speed despite the ache in her arms. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on her freckled face, pale from too many skipped meals. She peeled off Sophia's soaked diaper, rationing her last 3 wipes with surgical precision. No money for more until San Francisco, until Aunt Clara's paycheck hit. "We're almost there, baby," she whispered, kissing Sophia's forehead, her voice trembling with a hope she barely believed. The job at Bella Vita, Clara's Italian haven on Columbus Avenue, was her lifeline, a chance to trade diner grease for pasta dough, to give Sophia a crib instead of a second-hand car seat. But as she snapped Sophia's onesie shut, a tear slipped free, the weight of Ethan's earlier kindness clashing with the memory of his cruelty. He'd seen her, really seen her, and that terrified her more than his insults ever could. Back at row 23, Ethan's resolve cracked. He flipped open his briefcase, pulling out the letter, a crisp envelope stamped with his firm's logo, addressed to Lydia Harper, legal guardian of Sophia Harper. His hands shook as he unfolded it, the words blurring through a haze of dread. Daniel Grayson, deceased, motorcycle accident, October 2024, estate valued at $4.20 million, sole heir Sophia Harper, executor Ethan Caldwell. He'd been assigned the case a month ago, a routine probate for a tech mogul who died in a drunken crash, until he'd found the private investigator's report, photos of Lydia and Sophia in their Chicago slum. Daniel's scrawled note, "Make it right. I fucked up." Ethan's breath hitched. He'd flown out to meet her tomorrow, to deliver this bombshell in a sterile office, not here, not now, after he'd held her daughter and felt her hand in his. Lydia returned, settling Sophia back into her lap, the baby's eyes fluttering open with a sleepy babble. "She's awake again," she said, forcing a smile, and Ethan's heart sank, the letter a lead weight in his hands. He tucked it back into the briefcase, but too late. Lydia's gaze caught the motion, her brow furrowing. "What's that?" she asked, her voice sharp with sudden suspicion, the trust they'd built teetering on a knife's edge. Ethan froze, his mouth dry. It's nothing," he stammered, but the lie curdled in his throat and she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Don't bullshit me, Ethan. You've been weird since I got back. What's in there?" His pulse raced, a bead of sweat trickling down his neck as the plane shuddered through light turbulence. "Lydia, he started, but she cut him off, her voice rising raw and desperate. "Tell me. I've had enough of secrets, enough of men hiding shit from me. Daniel did that, left me with nothing but lies. Don't you dare do it too." Sophia whimpered, sensing the tension, and Ethan's resolve shattered. He pulled the letter out, holding it like a live grenade, his voice barely audible over the engines. "It's about Daniel. He's dead, Lydia. Motorcycle crash last month. And he left everything to Sophia. Millions. I'm handling his estate." The words hit her like a freight train, her face draining of color, freckles stark against her ashen skin. "What?" she whispered, her voice a broken thread, her arms tightening around Sophia as if to shield her from the truth. Ethan pressed on, his own voice cracking with the weight of it. "He hired a PI to find you 6 months ago. Wanted to fix things, but he didn't make it. I was supposed to tell you tomorrow in San Francisco. I didn't know it was you, not until tonight, until you said his name." Lydia's eyes darted to the letter, then back to him, a storm of disbelief and rage brewing. Dead? She choked out, tears spilling hot and fast. And rich? All this time, all this fucking time, I've been starving Ethan. Counting pennies for diapers, sleeping on the floor so she could have the bed, and he was out there, what, living it up. Ethan reached for her, but she jerked back, her sob ripping through the cabin, drawing sleepy glares from nearby passengers. Lydia, I didn't know, he pleaded, but she shook her head, her voice rising, jagged with pain. You knew. You had that letter and you sat there holding my kid, acting like some goddamn saint while I told you how he left us. Were you laughing inside? Poor little Lydia, too stupid to know she's sitting next to her ticket out. Sophia wailed now, her cries a piercing echo of her mother's anguish, and Ethan's heart fractured, his own tears welling as he gripped the armrest. No. Christ, no, I wasn't laughing. I was falling for you, okay? You and Sophia, you got under my skin and I didn't want to ruin it with this. Her breath hitched, his confession a punch to her already reeling mind. Falling for me? She spat, half laughing through her sobs, the sound bitter and wild. You don't even know me. I'm a mess, Ethan, a broke, scared mess, and you're what? Some fancy lawyer with a dead family and a guilt trip? This isn't a fucking fairy tale. The plane lurched again harder and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Folks, we're hitting some rough air, please stay seated. But Lydia barely heard it, her world collapsing under the weight of Daniel's death, the money, Ethan's words, a chaotic swirl of betrayal and impossible hope. Ethan's hands shook as he shoved the letter toward her, his voice raw, desperate. Read it then. See for yourself. I'm not lying, I'm not him. I fucked up tonight, yeah, calling you those things, but this is real. Sophia's his heir and you're her guardian. It's yours, all of it, and I'm just the idiot who didn't tell you sooner because I couldn't stand the thought of you hating me. Lydia snatched the letter, her fingers trembling as she scanned the legal jargon. The numbers, $4.2 million, blurring through her tears. Oh God, she gasped, her voice breaking as Sophia's cries softened into hiccups. He knew about us? He watched us struggle and did nothing until he was dead. He regretted it, Ethan said, his voice thick, leaning closer despite her flinch. That's what the PI said. He was planning to reach out, but the crash, it took him before he could. I should have told you the second I realized, but I was selfish. I wanted us, to be real first. Lydia's sobs deepened, a guttural sound of grief and fury, and she clutched Sophia tighter, the baby's warmth her only anchor. Selfish? She cried, her eyes blazing through the tears. I've been eating ramen packets, Ethan, skipping doctor visits because I couldn't pay, and you wanted to play house on a plane? My baby deserved better than this, better than him, better than me. Ethan's tears fell now, unashamed, his voice a ragged plea. You're right. She does. And you do too. I can't change what Daniel did or what I said, but I can help you now. Not because of the job, not because of the money, because I see you, Lydia. I see how hard you fight, how much you love her. I lost that chance with Lily, but you're still here, still fighting. His hand found hers, trembling but firm, and this time she didn't pull away, her sobs shaking them both as Sophia reached for his tie, her tiny fingers bridging the gap. The plane steadied, the turbulence fading, but their world hung in limbo, teetering between collapse and redemption. Why didn't you just tell me? She whispered, her voice raw, exhausted, searching his face for answers. Ethan squeezed her hand, his green eyes locked on hers, glistening with regret and something deeper. Because I was scared, he admitted, his voice breaking. Scared you'd think I was just the suit with the check, not the guy who held your kid and felt alive again. I haven't felt that since then. You gave me that, Lydia, you and Sophia, and I didn't want to lose it. Her breath caught, a sob turning into a shaky laugh, the absurdity and beauty of it crashing over her. You're an idiot, she said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, Sophia babbling softly between them. A rich, stupid idiot. Ethan chuckled, a wet, broken sound, and nodded. Yeah, guilty as charged. But I'm your idiot if you'll let me be. The words hung there, fragile and bold, and Lydia's heart thumped, a wild mix of fear and longing. She looked at Sophia, then at him, his rumpled suit, his tear-streaked face, and felt the storm inside her shift, not to calm but to something alive, something possible. I don't know what this means, she said finally, her voice trembling but steadying, clutching the letter like a lifeline. Daniel, the money it's too much. But I don't want to lose this either. Not yet. Ethan's smile was small, tentative, but it lit his eyes, chasing the shadows away. Then don't, he said, his thumb brushing her knuckles. We'll figure it out, together. For her. He nodded at Sophia, who giggled, tugging his tie, and Lydia's tears fell anew, but these were softer, laced with a hope she hadn't dared feel in years. The captain announced their final descent, the lights of San Francisco glimmering below, but Lydia and Ethan barely noticed, lost in a moment too big, too real to grasp fully. The letter changed everything, Sophia's future, Lydia's life, but the real shift was here in the space between them, where a secret had broken them open and left something new in its wake. As the plane dipped, their hands stayed clasped, Sophia's warmth binding them, and neither knew that this was just the start, a climax of pain and promise that would redefine them both before the wheels touched the tarmac. The Boeing 737 began its descent into San Francisco, the cabin lights flickering as the city's golden glow pierced the night beyond the window. Lydia Harper sat rigid in her middle seat, Sophia nestled against her chest, the baby's soft snores a fragile lifeline amid the storm churning inside her. The letter in her lap, Daniel's death, the $4.2 million inheritance for Sophia, felt like a bomb that had already detonated, leaving her reeling, her freckled hands trembling as she folded and unfolded its edges. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell's presence was a paradox. A man who'd screamed "fucking thief" at her hours ago, then bared his soul with apologies and tears, confessing a pull toward her that made her heart thud and her stomach twist. His rumpled suit, stained with formula, and his green eyes, raw with guilt and something softer, clashed with the memory of his venom, words that still carved a jagged wound in her chest, unhealed despite his remorse. Ethan watched her, his fingers twitching against his knee, the weight of the past hours pressing down like a vice. Finding his wallet in the bathroom had gutted him, his accusations against Lydia a stain on his conscience he couldn't scrub clean. But her strength, the way she'd fought through his cruelty, cradled Sophia through her own tears, had cracked open a part of him he'd buried with Lily and Catherine. He'd felt it when he'd held Sophia, when their hands brushed, when she'd let him glimpse her scars. Daniel's abandonment, the diner's grind, a life of counting pennies while he'd sipped scotch in penthouses. The letter had changed her future, but it was her, Lydia, who'd changed him, stirring a longing he hadn't known since his family slipped away. Yet her silence now, her guarded glances, told him the bridge he'd tried to build was crumbling, and he'd do anything to shore it up. Lydia's breath hitched as the plane dipped, her mind a tangle of grief and wary hope. Daniel's death, the man who'd left her with a locket and a mountain of debt, was a bitter pill, the millions he'd hoarded a cruel twist after years of scraping by. Ethan's role as executor, his confession of falling for her, only muddied the waters. "You're an idiot," she'd called him, half laughing through tears, but the warmth of that moment felt distant now, overshadowed by the echo of lowlife and thief. She wanted to believe him, his apologies, his tenderness with Sophia, but the wound festered, a reminder of every time she'd been judged, discarded, seen as less. Her fingers tightened around Sophia, her anchor, and she whispered, "We don't need anyone, baby," a mantra she'd clung to since Daniel's door slammed shut. Ethan sensed the wall rising, her quiet a blade sharper than her earlier sobs. "Lydia," he said, his voice low, urgent as the plane's wheels grazed the runway with a jolt. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on Sophia, but he pressed on, desperation clawing at him. "I know I fucked up, I know it's still there what I said. But I meant every word after. You and Sophia, you're not just some case to me. I need you to see that." Her lips parted, a shaky breath escaping, but she shook her head, her voice tight. "You don't get it, Ethan. You saw me as trash, a thief, before you saw anything else. That's what sticks. I've had enough of men who only care when it's convenient." His chest ached, her words a mirror to his shame, but he couldn't let her slip away. The plane taxied to the gate, passengers stirring, but Ethan leaned closer, his hand reaching for hers. "I was wrong, dead wrong, and I'll spend every damn day proving it if you let me. I'm not Daniel, Lydia. I'm not walking away." She pulled back, her hands slipping free, her eyes flashing with hurt and defiance. "Prove it? You think a few nice words fix it? I've been surviving alone, me and her, and I don't need your pity or your promises. Not after that." Sophia stirred, her tiny whimper cutting through the tension, and Lydia's focus snapped to her daughter, shutting him out. The cabin doors opened, a rush of cool San Francisco air flooding in, but Ethan's resolve hardened. He grabbed his briefcase, standing as she gathered Sophia's things, the patched diaper bag, the crumpled burp cloth, her movements mechanical, guarded. "Lydia, wait," he said, stepping into the aisle, blocking her path as passengers streamed past. She glared up at him, her freckles stark against her flushed cheeks. "Move, Ethan. We're done here. But he didn't budge, his voice dropping to a raw plea. No, we're not. You're not walking out of my life like this. Not after tonight, not after what I felt. I'm not letting you go. Before she could protest, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him with a force born of desperation, his grip firm but trembling. Get off me. Lydia snapped, yanking back, but the motion was too sharp, too sudden. A ripping sound tore through the air. Her sweater, already threadbare, split at the shoulder, the fabric giving way under his pull. She gasped, stumbling. Sophia clutched tight in her other arm, as the torn sleeve flapped open, exposing her bare shoulder. Ethan froze, his hand still on her wrist, his breath catching as his eyes locked on something. A red birthmark, irregular and vivid. Staining her skin like a crimson teardrop. Time stopped, the bustle of the cabin fading to a dull roar as a floodgate burst inside him, memories crashing through the haze of years. A little girl with that same mark, laughing in a Chicago park, her hair wild in the wind, her hand in his as they chased fireflies under a summer sky. Lydia? He whispered, his voice breaking, his grip loosening as his knees buckled. She jerked free, clutching the torn sleeve, her face a mask of confusion and fury. What the hell's wrong with you? She demanded, but his eyes, wide, glistening, lost, stopped her cold. He sank back against the seat, his hands shaking as he stared at her, tears spilling down his cheeks. It's you, he choked out, the words a sob. That mark, I know it. You're her. The girl from Humboldt Park, the one God, Lydia, I loved you. When we were kids. It was you. Her breath seized, his words a thunderclap in her chest, splintering her anger into 1,000 jagged pieces. What? She rasped, her voice barely audible, Sophia's weight grounding her as the world tilted. Ethan's tears fell faster, his voice raw, unraveling. Summer of '98. I was 10, you were 8. We met at the park, your mom brought you, my dad dragged me. You had that mark, showed it to me when we hid under the slide. Said it looked like a heart. We promised to find each other again. I never forgot you, Lydia. Never. His hands reached for her, hesitant, reverent, as if she might vanish. I thought I'd lost you forever, then Lily Catherine, but it's you. It's always been you. Lydia's knees weakened, a sob clawing up her throat as fragments of memory flickered. A boy with green eyes, a dirty t-shirt, a promise whispered in the dusk. She'd buried it, lost it under years of foster homes, hunger, Daniel's betrayal, but now it roared back, vivid and searing. Ethan? She whispered, her voice trembling, the name a question, a lifeline. He nodded, his sobs mingling with hers, and she sank into the seat, Sophia between them, her torn sleeve forgotten. I remember, she gasped, tears streaming as the wound of his accusation collided with this impossible truth. You gave me a daisy. Said it matched my hair. Oh God, how didn't I know? He reached for her again, slower this time, his hand trembling as it cupped her cheek, wiping her tears with his thumb. I didn't either, he said, his voice thick, breaking. Not until now. I fucked up tonight, I hurt you and I'll hate myself forever for it, but this? It's real, Lydia. It's been real since we were kids. She flinched at his touch, the sting of thief still echoing, but his eyes, those same green eyes from a lifetime ago, held her, pleading, stripping her defenses bare. I can't, she choked, pulling back, her heart a war zone of love and pain. You hurt me, Ethan. That doesn't just go away, not even for this. His face crumpled, but he didn't retreat, his hand dropping to Sophia's, the baby's fingers curling around his. I know, he said, his voice a ragged whisper. I don't deserve you, not after that. But I'll fight for you, Lydia. Every day, every second, until you trust me again. I lost you once, I'm not losing you twice. The sincerity gutted her, a tidal wave of longing crashing against her fear, and she sobbed, her hand hovering over his, torn between running and falling. Sophia babbled, reaching for Ethan's tie, and the sight, her daughter's trust, his broken hope, shattered her resolve. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice raw, trembling as her fingers brushed his, a tentative surrender. I'm scared, of you, of this, of everything. But I feel it too. I always have. Ethan's breath hitched, a sob turning into a shaky laugh, and he pulled her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, his tears wetting her skin. Then we're scared together, he said, his voice steadying, fierce with promise. You, me, Sophia, will figure it out. I'm not going anywhere. The plane emptied around them, passengers shuffling toward baggage claim, but they stayed, locked in a bubble of tears and trembling hands. Lydia's sweater hung ragged, her birthmark a beacon of their past, and Ethan's suit, once pristine now a mess, mirrored her chaos. The captain's final call broke the spell and Ethan stood, offering his hand. "Let me help you off," he said, softer now, and she took it, her grip shaky but sure, Sophia cradled between them. They stepped into the terminal, the cool air a shock after the cabin's heat, and Lydia paused, her eyes searching his. "What now?" she asked, her voice small, vulnerable. Ethan smiled, a real smile tinged with pain and hope. "Dinner?" he said, shifting Sophia's weight as she clung to his tie. "There's this Italian place on Columbus, Bella Vita. I hear they make pasta from scratch." Lydia laughed, a wet, broken sound that lit her face, chasing the shadows. "I know it," she said, wiping her eyes. "It's where I'm headed, Aunt Clara's." His eyes widened, a spark of fate igniting, and he laughed too, pulling her closer. "Then it's a date," he said, and she nodded, her hand tightening in his. As they walked toward baggage claim, Sophia's head resting on Ethan's shoulder, Lydia felt the weight of the night, Daniel's betrayal, Ethan's accusations, their impossible reunion, shift into something new, not just an inheritance but a second chance. The wound lingered, a scar she'd carry, but his touch, his tears, promised healing. "You said love shows up unexpected," she murmured, recalling his earlier words about Catherine, and he nodded, his eyes glistening. "Yeah. And it found us twice." She slipped her hand into his pocket, finding the daisy charm on his keychain, a keepsake he'd never explained, and gasped, her tears falling anew as Sophia giggled, binding them tighter. In the San Francisco night, surrounded by strangers rushing to their own lives, they kissed, brief, tender, electric, a vow witnessed by a sleeping baby who'd brought two lost souls back together. The money would change Lydia's world, but this, Ethan, Sophia, a love reborn from ashes, was the treasure, raw and real, forged in a flight that had broken them to remake them whole. The San Francisco International Airport buzzed with late-night travelers, their hurried footsteps and rolling suitcases a dull roar against the glass walls of the terminal. Lydia Harper stood frozen beside Ethan Caldwell, her torn sweater dangling from her shoulder, the red birthmark still raw and exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sophia slept soundly against Ethan's chest, her tiny hand tangled in his silk tie, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just rocked her mother's world. The air smelled of jet fuel and stale coffee, but all Lydia could feel was the heat of Ethan's hand in hers, his daisy charm pressed into her palm like a relic from a life she'd forgotten. That kiss, brief, trembling, electric, lingered on her lips, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Her heart pounded, a chaotic drumbeat of hope, fear, and the sting of his earlier words, "fucking thief," that refused to fade even as his tears and the memory of Humboldt Park 98 rewrote their story. Ethan's green eyes locked on hers, glistening with a mix of awe and desperation, his rumpled suit a stark contrast to the polished lawyer she'd met hours ago. The revelation of their childhood, the boy with the daisy, the girl with the birthmark, had shattered him, piecing together a puzzle he'd carried for decades. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough, barely audible over the terminal din, "we need to talk, really talk." "Not here." He shifted Sophia's weight, her soft breath steadying him, and gestured toward the baggage claim. "Let's get your stuff, figure this out. Please." His plea was raw, a man teetering on the edge of losing something he'd just found, and Lydia's throat tightened, torn between the pull of his touch and the bruise of his betrayal. She nodded, her grip on his hand faltering but not breaking, and they moved through the crowd, a fragile trio bound by secrets and scars. The baggage claim was a chaotic swirl, families reuniting, business travelers barking into phones, but Lydia felt detached, her mind spinning. Daniel's death, the $4.2 million inheritance, Ethan's role as executor, it was a tidal wave she couldn't process, crashing against the fragile memory of a summer day when a boy named Ethan had promised her forever under a park slide. "I don't know what I'm doing," she muttered, her voice cracking as they reached the carousel, her patched diaper bag tumbling into view. Ethan grabbed it, his fingers brushing hers, and she flinched, the wound of lowlife, flaring despite his remorse. "I know," he said, slinging the bag over his shoulder, his eyes searching hers. "And I don't deserve you to figure it out with me, not after what I did. But I'm begging you, Lydia. Give me a chance to show you who I am, who I was to you." His voice trembled and Sophia stirred, her babble breaking the tension as she tugged his tie harder. Lydia's lips twitched, a reluctant smile fighting through her tears, and she took Sophia back, the baby's warmth grounding her. "You're still an idiot," she said, echoing her earlier words, but softer now, laced with a pain she couldn't hide. "A rich, stupid idiot who thinks a daisy fixes everything." Ethan chuckled, a wet, broken sound, and pulled the daisy charm from his pocket, holding it out like an offering. "It's not about fixing," he said, his voice steadying. "It's about remembering. I kept this, all these years, because that girl under the slide was my first real thing. I didn't know it was you not until tonight, but it's always been you." Lydia's breath hitched, her fingers closing around the charm, its worn petals a bridge to a time before Daniel, before poverty, before she'd learned to mistrust. "I remember," she whispered, tears spilling anew, "but it doesn't erase what you set up there. I can't just forget." His face fell, but he nodded, stepping closer, his hand hovering near her cheek. "I don't expect you to. I'll earn it, every damn day, if you let me start now." Before she could answer, a voice cut through the crowd, sharp, familiar, and edged with exhaustion. "Lydia? Oh my God, there you are." Aunt Clara pushed through, her graying hair wild, her apron still dusted with flour from Bella Vita. She froze, eyeing Ethan, his suit, Sophia in his arms, and then Lydia's torn sleeve, her birthmark glaring under the lights. "What the hell happened? Who's this?" Lydia's heart leapt, relief clashing with dread as she hugged Clara, Sophia squirming between them. It's a long story," she said, her voice shaky. "This is Ethan. He's helping." Clara's eyes narrowed, flicking to Ethan, who offered a sheepish nod. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, extending a hand. I'm with the estate. And more." Clara's brow arched, but she shook his hand, her grip firm. "Estate? What estate?" "Lydia, what's going on?" Lydia swallowed, the letter burning in her pocket, and handed it to Clara, her voice breaking. "Daniel's dead. Left Sophia everything, millions. Ethan's the lawyer. And we knew each other. A long time ago." Clara's jaw dropped, her eyes scanning the letter, then darting between them. "Jesus Christ, kid," she breathed, pulling Lydia into another hug. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Lydia sobbed into her aunt's shoulder, the weight of the night crashing down. Daniel's betrayal, Ethan's accusations, their impossible reunion. Ethan stood back, his hands stuffed in his pockets, guilt and longing warring in his chest as he watched the woman he'd loved twice slip into someone else's comfort. The drive to Bella Vita was a blur, Clara's beat-up Toyota weaving through San Francisco's foggy streets, Lydia in the passenger seat with Sophia, Ethan in the back, his briefcase a silent passenger beside him. The restaurant loomed ahead, its neon sign flickering, Bella Vita, Italian comfort, a beacon of the life Lydia had chased. Inside, the smell of garlic and fresh pasta hit her like a memory, her grandmother's recipes alive in the air, and she sank into a booth, Sophia on her lap, Clara bustling to the kitchen for food. Ethan slid in across from her, his eyes soft but urgent. "This place," he said, glancing around, "it's where you're starting over, right?" Lydia nodded, her fingers tracing Sophia's hair, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah. Clara's giving me a shot. Better pay, maybe insurance. I need it to work." "It will," he said, leaning forward, his voice firm. "You're tougher than anyone I've met, Lydia. And I want to be here for it. For you." She looked up, her eyes glistening, the wound flaring again. "You don't get to just decide that," she said, her voice low, sharp. "You call me trash, Ethan. A thief. I can't unhear it, not even with daisies and sob stories. I've been burned too much." His face crumpled, but he reached across the table, his hand open, pleading. "I know. And I hate myself for it, more than you can imagine. But I'm not him. I'm not Daniel. I'm the kid who promised you forever and I fucked up, but I'm still here begging you to let me try." Before she could answer, Clara returned, sliding plates of spaghetti carbonara onto the table, her eyes flicking between them. "Eat," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You both look like hell." Lydia managed a weak laugh, twirling pasta for Sophia, the normalcy a lifeline. Ethan ate too, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every bite might keep him in her orbit. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words, until Sophia reached for Ethan's fork, giggling, and he handed it over, his smile breaking through the tension. "She's got your spirit," he said, and Lydia's heart thudded, a crack in her armor widening. As Clara cleared the plates, Ethan stood, his voice trembling but resolute. "Lydia, walk with me just outside. 5 minutes. Please." She hesitated, Clara's warning glance burning into her, but Sophia's trust in him, her daughter's easy laughter, tipped the scale. Fine, she said, scooping Sophia up, and followed him into the foggy night, the streetlights casting long shadows over Columbus Avenue. He stopped by a lamppost, his breath visible in the chill, and turned to her, his eyes blazing with a mix of fear and hope. I'm not asking you to love me, not yet, he said, his voice cracking. I'm asking you to let me stay. To prove I'm not the asshole from row 23, but the kid who saw you, really saw you, before life broke us both. Lydia's tears fell, her voice a whisper as Sophia nuzzled her neck. I want to believe you, she said, her heart a battlefield. But it hurts, you hurt me and I'm scared it'll happen again. I've got her to protect now. Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing her torn sleeve, the birthmark a silent vow between them. I'd die before I hurt her, or you again, he said, his voice fierce, breaking. I lost you once, Lydia. I lost Lily Catherine. I can't lose you twice. Let me fight for this, for us. Her sob broke free, a raw, guttural sound, and she swayed, the weight of his words crashing through her defenses. He caught her arm, steadying her, and their eyes locked, the fog swirling around them like a dream. Okay, she gasped, her voice trembling, a surrender she hadn't planned. But slow, we go slow. I can't fall too fast. Ethan's tears fell, a shaky laugh escaping as he pulled her into his arms, Sophia between them, her warmth sealing the pact. Slow, he promised, his lips brushing her forehead, a tender echo of their kiss. As slow as you need. They stood there wrapped in fog and fragile hope, until Clara called them back, her voice cutting through the night. Inside, Bella Vita glowed, a haven of pasta and second chances, and as they sat together, Lydia feeding Sophia, Ethan pouring wine from Clara's stash, a new rhythm emerged, tentative but real. The inheritance loomed, a fortune that would lift Lydia from poverty, but it was this. His hand brushing hers, her laugh at Sophia's antics, that felt like wealth. Later, as Clara locked up, Ethan slipped the daisy charm into Lydia's pocket, whispering, for keeps, and she smiled, her wound still there but softening, a scar kissed by time. The San Francisco dawn broke as they left, Ethan carrying Sophia's bag, Lydia's hand in his, the city stretching before them, a canvas of endings and beginnings, painted with the ghosts of Humboldt Park and the promise of Bella Vita. They weren't whole, not yet, but they were together, two broken souls mending in the light of a love lost and found, with Sophia's giggles the thread stitching their future tight. The San Francisco fog clung to the windows of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse condo, a sleek high-rise overlooking the bay, its glass walls reflecting the golden hues of a late September afternoon. Lydia Harper stood in the living room, her patched sneakers sinking into the plush cream carpet, a stark contrast to the cracked linoleum of her old Chicago studio. Sophia gurgled happily in a brand-new crib, a gift from Ethan, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed bunny he'd picked up at a boutique on Market Street. 2 months had passed since that fateful flight, since the revelation of Daniel's inheritance and their childhood love under the Humboldt Park slide. The $4.2 million had lifted Lydia from the brink, paid off debts, secured a savings account, bought Sophia clothes that weren't second-hand, but it was Ethan's persistence, his slow, steady presence, that had convinced her to move in, to test this fragile, blooming thing between them. Ethan leaned against the kitchen island, his tie loosened after a day at the firm, his green eyes soft as he watched Lydia unpack a box of her meager belongings. A thrift store lamp, Sophia's safety card from the plane, the daisy charm he'd given her. You sure about this? He asked, his voice low, laced with the same vulnerability he'd shown in the fog outside Bella Vita. I don't want you to feel rushed. Lydia glanced up, her freckled fingers pausing on a cracked photo frame. Her and Sophia at the diner, a rare smile caught mid-shift. I'm sure, she said, her tone firm but tinged with the unease that still lingered, a scar from his accusation of theft that hadn't fully healed. Sophia needs stability, a real home. And you've been good to us. Her lips twitched, a reluctant warmth breaking through, and Ethan's smile widened, a flicker of the boy who'd chased fireflies with her decades ago. The past weeks had been a whirlwind, settling into Bella Vita's kitchen under Aunt Clara's gruff guidance, navigating the legal maze of Daniel's estate with Ethan's help, and letting him in inch by cautious inch. He'd kept his promise to go slow, late-night talks over wine, mornings with Sophia giggling between them, quiet moments where his hand found hers and she didn't pull away. The wound of fucking thief had softened, stitched by his apologies and the daisy charm she now wore on a chain, but doubts gnawed at her, whispers of mistrust she couldn't silence. Was this too good, too fast, for a girl who'd spent her life scraping by? She pushed the thought down, focusing on Sophia's coups, and turned to Ethan. Where's your stuff? she asked, nodding at the bare shelves. This place feels like a showroom. He chuckled, rubbing his neck, a sheepish edge to his grin. Most of it's in storage. After Catherine and Lily, I didn't want reminders. But there's an old album somewhere. My mom's. She insisted I keep it. He crossed to a cabinet near the fireplace, pulling out a leather-bound book, its edges worn but gold-embossed with Caldwell family memories. She's coming tomorrow, by the way, he added, setting it on the coffee table. Can't wait to meet you and Sophia. Been hounding me about it since I told her. Lydia's stomach fluttered, a mix of nerves and curiosity about the woman who'd raised the boy she'd loved, then lost, then found again. She sounds intense, she said, and Ethan laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. You have no idea. Dinner passed in a haze of pasta, Ethan's attempt at carbonara, a nod to Bella Vita, and Sophia's delighted squeals as he fed her tiny bites. Later, with Sophia asleep in her crib, Lydia sank onto the couch, the album catching her eye. Ethan was in the shower, the hum of water a distant comfort, and curiosity tugged at her. She flipped it open, the pages creaking with age. Ethan as a baby, gap-toothed and grinning. A younger Ethan with a fishing rod, his father stern beside him. A woman with sharp cheekbones and auburn hair, her smile tight but proud. Margaret Caldwell, the caption read, and Lydia's lips curved. His mother, the single mom who'd pushed him to law school, who'd shaped the man he'd become. She turned the pages, a soft ache building as she traced his past. A past she'd missed, a life of little league games and birthday cakes while she'd bounced through foster homes after her own family shattered. Then a photo slipped free, fluttering to the carpet. A candid shot, faded but clear, of Margaret, younger, laughing beside a man with dark hair and a familiar jawline. Lydia's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she picked it up, her eyes locking on the man's face. She knew that jaw, that crooked smile. It was her father, Thomas Harper, the man who'd walked out when she was 6, leaving her and her mother to drown in debt and despair. The caption scrawled beneath read, Maggie and Tom, summer '96, and the date, 2 years before he'd vanished, hit her like a punch. No, she whispered, her voice a broken thread, the room spinning as the pieces slammed together. Margaret Caldwell, Ethan's mother, had been with her father. A single woman, bold and beautiful, cackling in a photo with the man who'd abandoned Lydia's mother, who'd left them to fend for themselves until her mom broke under the strain, losing the house, losing everything. Lydia's chest heaved, a sob clawing up her throat as the album tumbled from her lap, pages splaying across the floor. The birthmark on her shoulder burned, a cruel irony, the mark Ethan had loved as a child now tied to the woman who'd wrecked her life. The shower cut off and Ethan emerged, towel around his waist, his hair damp and tousled. Hey, you okay? He called, then froze, his eyes darting to the album, the photo in her shaking hand. Lydia? His voice dropped, panic edging in as he crossed the room, kneeling beside her. What's wrong? What? She thrust the photo at him, her sob breaking free, raw and guttural. This, she cried, her voice shattering the quiet. Your mom, Margaret, she was with my dad. She's the reason he left us, Ethan. The reason I grew up with nothing. No home, no family, just me and Mom scrambling until she couldn't anymore. Ethan's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he took the photo, his eyes scanning it, disbelief warring with dawning horror. What? No, that can't, he stammered, but the evidence stared back, undeniable. My mom, she never said. I didn't know. Lydia yanked away, standing, her torn sweater flapping as she clutched her arms, tears streaming. Didn't know, she spat, her voice rising, jagged with pain. She fucked my dad, Ethan. She was the other woman, the single mom who thought she could take him, and he let her. He walked out, left us broke, left Mom crying herself to death, and I ended up in foster care because of her. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor, the photo slipping from his fingers, his tears falling fast and silent. Lydia, I swear, I had no idea, he choked, his voice a wreck. She raised me alone, said my dad split before I was born, but she never told me this. He reached for her, desperate, but she recoiled, her sob a howl of betrayal. Don't touch me, she screamed, Sophia stirring in the crib, her whimpers echoing Lydia's anguish. Your family, you've been ruining me since I was a kid. First her, then you with your thief bullshit. I trusted you, Ethan, and now this. He crawled toward her, his hands outstretched, tears streaking his face. Please, I didn't know, I'd never. I love you, Lydia, you and Sophia. This doesn't change that. His voice broke, a plea torn from his core, but she shook her head, backing toward the crib, her world crumbling again. Love? She laughed, bitter and wild, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Your mom took my family, Ethan. Left me to starve while she, what? Played house with him? And you expect me to just move in, play happy with you? Ethan's sob matched hers, his hands clawing at the carpet, the daisy charm glinting on her neck a cruel mockery now. I'll fix it, he gasped, his voice ragged. I'll confront her, tomorrow when she gets here. I'll make her tell me everything, make her pay if she did this. I'll do anything, Lydia, anything to keep you. She stared at him, her chest heaving, the boy from Humboldt Park drowning in the man she'd let in, the man whose mother had unknowingly shaped her misery. Fix it, she whispered, her voice hollow. You can't fix this. Not this. Sophia's cries pierced the air, and Lydia scooped her up, rocking her, the baby's warmth her only anchor as Ethan knelt, broken, before her. I need time, she said finally, her voice trembling, a lifeline she threw despite the abyss between them. I can't stay here tonight. Not with this. She grabbed her bag, the patched relic of her old life, and headed for the door, Ethan's sob following her. Lydia, please don't go, he begged, scrambling to his feet, but she turned, her eyes blazing through tears. I have to, she said, her voice steadying, fierce. For me. For her. Figure out your mom, Ethan. Then maybe we'll talk. The door slammed, the sound a gunshot in the silent condo, and Ethan collapsed, the photo of Margaret and Thomas staring up at him, a ghost from a past he hadn't known he'd inherited. Lydia stumbled into the fog, Sophia clutched tight, the daisy charm cold against her skin, her heart a war zone of love and hate. She hailed a cab to Clara's, the city blurring through her tears, and as the lights of Ethan's penthouse faded, she whispered to Sophia, "We'll be okay," a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The next day loomed, Margaret's arrival, Ethan's confrontation, a truth that could either mend or destroy them. Lydia's future hung in the balance, the inheritance a hollow victory against this new wound, and Ethan's love, a love reborn from childhood, teetered on the edge of ruin. Would she forgive him, forgive the sins of his mother? Could they rebuild from this wreckage, or would the past claim them both? The story pauses here, a heartbeat suspended, leaving you, dear reader, with questions burning. Will Lydia face Margaret and unearth the full truth? Can Ethan prove his love beyond the shadows of his family's betrayal? And what becomes of Sophia, caught in the crossfire of a love so tangled with pain? This is no tidy end, it's a cliffhanger, a breath held, a story begging to breathe again. Do you want to know what happens next? Does this tale of heartbreak, secrets, and fragile hope deserve a part 2? Let us know. Hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel, Soul Deep Stories, and join us for the next chapter. Your voice decides if Lydia and Ethan's journey continues. Don't miss it.